Hi and welcome to this lesson on Storm on the Island by Seamus Heaney. This is a good poem. It's very easy compared to some poems that you might study, but it does still have complex ideas. So if you're struggling with poetry, it's not really your thing generally, or if you're a bit daunted by the collection, this is a good place to start. And hopefully by the end of the lesson, you'll understand the overall simple ideas, but also some of the more complex ideas behind it. I remember this being one of the first poems I studied at GCSE as well, years ago. So it's one of those that stays on GCSE syllabuses for a long time. So yeah, the main idea, as indicated by the title, is that there's a storm on an island somewhere. So it's about weather, nature. Even from the title, you can start thinking about themes and ideas. The way that weather changes maybe, and that land is stable underneath, that kind of thing. There's a few key vocab points, so I want you to just have a quick look through those. Pause the video if you're not sure about what these vocab points mean, and just make sure that you understand them all before we move on to the main story. I also want you to pause me and read the poem aloud. I can't read it because of copyright. So read the poem aloud to yourself or listen to a recording if you're not confident reading yourself. Even if you're not confident reading, I really encourage you to read aloud because it helps you improve quite quickly that way. I have a lot of students that start with me that are just really not happy with reading. Obviously, as an English teacher, that's something that a lot of people come to for. And the main thing I do, which sounds kind of brutal, but I just make them read and read aloud and read more. And then within a few weeks, they're fine. So yeah, even if you're not confident, you can improve your confidence that way just by repeating. And this is a good one to start with, like I said. So yeah, pause me and look at the vocab, read the poem, and when you're ready, we can jump into the story. So the story then, I've kind of written this in the voice of the speaker because it helps you understand a bit more what's going on. I'm going to just read it aloud and I'll kind of expand a little bit on what I've written as we go. We are prepared. We build houses that are squat, they're short and strong. We do this by sinking walls into rock and covering them with good roofs made of slate. Slate is a kind of thin stone material. It kind of grows in sheets, or it forms in sheets. It's very good for roofing. A lot of houses in European countries are made with slate roofs. My old house I used to live in actually had a slate roof, and it's really frightening in a storm because whenever we had storms, they would just sometimes dislodge off the roof and smash really far from the roof into the ground around the house. And it reminded me always of Storm on the Island, that kind of feeling of the storm outside being very powerful and frightening. So the old wrinkled earth has never given us hay. So as you can see, there are no haystacks or grain or wheat that can be lost. Nor are there trees which might be helpful to us when the storm blows full blast. You know what I mean. Leaves and branches can make a lot of noise in a storm, so that you can listen to the thing you fear, forgetting that it's attacking your house too. So he's thinking, if there were more trees around, they might be a distraction. They might also provide a little bit of shelter from the full force of the storm, but there is nothing on the type of island that these people are living on. It's a very cold and bare island full of rock where nothing grows. You might think that the sea is company as it explodes comfortably down there on the cliffs below us, but no. When the storm begins, the spray from the sea hits the windows of our houses and spits like a tame cat gone wild. We just sit there while the invisible wind dives and hovers around our house. Space is filled up with bangs and bursts like a war zone. I remember being really confused by that line to start with. He says space is a salvo. And I remember just taking ages to understand what does a salvo mean. So if that's a word that confuses you, I really recommend learning that one. It's actually very good for your power and conflict if that's the course that you're studying with the Heaney. So space is like a war zone full of bangs and bursts, as if There's a war going on. We are attacked by the empty air. It's so strange that we're afraid of nothing, a giant, huge nothing. So it's interesting. It's a kind of conflict between man and nature. And it's like a lot of poems in this collection about how powerful and eternal nature is, and how men are kind of always trying to adapt or fight against nature, but we're not really, when I say men, I mean humans in general, obviously. We're not really that well prepared, or, there's a lot of places in the world where you can live still, and if there's giant storms like tsunamis in Japan, they can just destroy entire cities and villages in a couple of days. So in some ways, we think of ourselves as very powerful when we're human beings, especially now because we're so advanced. We have a lot of technology. We're always building stronger materials that we can then build our world out of. But at the same time, there's certain extremes of weather that we just cannot deal with. No one lives in the middle of the desert, really. Well, not many people. There's actually things like Bedouin tribes that live in the desert, but generally people can't inhabit a desert or, the very high points of a mountain. And people struggle to live in places where there are cyclones or tsunamis or hurricanes or giant storms, especially sea storms like this one. So it's kind of reminding us about the relative frailty of man relative to the strength of nature. So we'll look at some language then. As always, I don't give all of the possible language things because it would just take me forever, and it's also good to find your own things that you connect with. So with the language sections of my poetry courses, I always give some key ideas, some of the most sophisticated or important analyses that I can find, things that I maybe personally would use in my own essays. But you always want to develop your own connection to the poem and always analyze things that you feel like you understand them well and they connect to you somehow. So feel free to annotate the poem with your own ideas after you've studied this lesson. It's always a good follow-up on a poem lesson to kind of learn about it first, and then when you feel confident, take it further and do some of your own analyses. So the adjective squat, it's a short little squat word itself, and it suggests strength and stockiness. Quite interesting. They build their houses not beautifully, they're not grand houses. They're kind of reacting to the weather and the wildness of the environment. So they're built short because they're stronger that way. It suggests that there's no room for beauty or elegance on this island, that it's quite a brutal environment to live in, and the inhabitants are forced to adapt. So you get different places in the world. Some places are quite easy and comfortable to live in, and other places have a harsh environment, harsh conditions. And this is one of the harsher places of the world. Usually with islands as well, a lot of people think of islands as tropical, but it's sort of reminding you that there's islands all over the world, and they have very different weathers and climates. The verb troubled is very important, and it's also contextual. It's got a lot of history to it. So if you're okay with just the basics of this poem, I maybe wouldn't go into that word troubled to start with. If you're quite confident with the basics of the poem, you can go into what does the word troubled mean. So firstly, it's quite straightforward. The wizened earth has never troubled us with hay. The earth is too old and kind of dry and wrinkled to make hay, to make plants and food. But to trouble someone with something is kind of like polite, like if you say sorry to trouble you, it means I'm trying to be polite. So there's this kind of weird contradictory meaning hiding within that word trouble, because he's saying, the earth hasn't bothered to give us hay, which to start with, he's trying to make it seem positive, but obviously it suggests that they have a really difficult life under that, because it's very hard to grow food where they live. So not only do they get attacked by the storm and have to build their houses in this really short, squat way, but then it's also difficult to grow food because, again, the weather is so violent. that it's not conducive to crops and farming. So the earth is infertile, but also the weather is quite brutal. And this creates a harsh environment. It suggests that it's much harsher than he is pretending it to be at the beginning, because he's like, we're prepared, we can deal with this. But actually, when he starts talking about what they have to deal with, we realize it's quite a lot. You can think about yourself and whether you would like to live on this island. I live technically on an island because I live in England, but the UK is an island, but, well, not the UK, but Scotland, Wales, England is an island. And it would be quite nice, I think, to live on a small island personally, but not this kind of island, not this kind of brutal, cold island. So we have this idea that there's a sense of political backdrop to this poem as well. It's very important, if you're wanting to get high levels, to be able to treat things in multiple angles of interpretation. So don't just stick to, it's about a storm. You also want to have the interpretation that it's about politics. So this idea of troubled also connotes, it has connotations of the troubles in Ireland, which is a really important conflict that occurred in the late 1900s. It was sort of when I was a really little child, and I remember things being on TV about it, people talking about it. So at the time, it was big in the news, and it was very important, and it had been going on for quite a while. So I'm going to do a bit more on the troubles when we get to the context section. We'll go back to that. But if you need high levels, or you're aiming for high levels in your essays, you want to do a double interpretation of this poem. On the one hand, it's about humans and nature. On the other hand, it's actually about political conflicts and the way that the state of the country is in versus the individuals that are affected by that. So some more basic ideas then. Plosive alliteration, blows full blast. Plosive B sounds are really good for war poetry or conflict poetry, because plosive sounds are physically explosive. You have to kind of blow air out of your mouth to make them. So B, P, V, those kinds of sounds are plosive. They're reminiscent. They remind us of a war zone, and they create fear because they're conveying the power of the wind. Blast is also enjambed to the next line. You write it this way. So if you're showing enjambement, you have to put a dash if it's a line break and a double dash if it's a stanza break. So it's kind of a surprise, blows full blast. And at this point, I think the poem changes a little bit as well, because he's like, kind of going through these images and talking quite generally. And then suddenly we get hit with a word like blast, which is quite a powerful, almost onomatopoeic word. I would say that blast sounds onomatopoeic. He uses it to talk about the weather. So it's kind of a neutral pronoun, kind of like an abstract force that's quite difficult to get hold of. It's kind of frightening because it makes it difficult to imagine. It's unnamed. It's just this kind of giant force of nature, and it's quite vague. So a religious person would interpret that kind of it that he's talking about perhaps as, expressive of their God. An atheistic person might interpret that as nature, or kind of the condition of nature and how it is. I really like this one, but again, this is a more higher level interpretation. A tragic chorus. In ancient Greek tragedy, which I really recommend you read at some point, it's really, really cool. I love Greek tragedy. You get this kind of drama that is tragic, and obviously we know mostly what the word tragic means is stuff to do that, with sadness. But actually, ancient Greek tragedy is not always sad. It has a whole range of quite negative, intense emotions like horror, fear, pain. The idea is that we're supposed to create pity and fear in the audience when we write a Greek tragedy. So you can talk about how this creates pathos, perhaps. Pathos is a Greek word that means sympathy or empathy, feeling sorry for something. So we might be afraid for the people on the island. We might be a bit nervous and worried about them. We might also pity them because they have really difficult lives, and you can do an interpretation of that. Chorus as well is a dramatic device. If you're interested, you're welcome to read my notes on what a chorus is, if you think that'll be useful for you. And we have some, again, abstract nouns, the idea that the nature is this kind of abstract force that's all around them. The ending, the word fear, is also an abstract noun, suggesting that there's this kind of invisible fear that is a response to the invisible wind that seems so frightening. So it's interesting, that idea of a huge nothing at the end, like this is so scary, but also you can't measure it or kind of see it or touch it clearly. There's nothing concrete about it. It's very abstracted. For anyone doing power and conflict poems, which this is part of, semantic field of war is really important here. Lots of different words that connote warfare and war zones and violence. Dives and strafes, specifically to do with the wind, reminds me personally of a bomber plane, because strafe is the kind of word that you would use to describe a warplane. And there's a bit of a naphra at the end as well. At the end of my notes, not the end of the poem. No trees, no natural shelter. The repetition of no shows how the speaker feels nature has kind of abandoned them, or nature is deliberately making their lives difficult. So hopefully you're starting to get a bit of a handle on this poem. It feels more kind of familiar to you, and hopefully most of you can sort of see the difference, or like how you can get that double analysis of, okay, it's about man and nature, but it's also about humans and politics versus the individual, or the way that the world can be versus the individual. So these people try to prepare, and then all this kind of chaos happens to them. I'm actually filming this lesson in the middle of the coronavirus pandemic, and so personally, I think everyone who's been through that, who's experiencing it at the moment, or if you're reading this or watching this at a later date, you've probably gone through it. You can kind of you can compare the way that we might feel about the virus situation to how these guys feel on the island, to the politics or the general world and what's going on. So the individual can prepare, but they, at some point, there's nothing more they can do, and they just have to wait it out and kind of sit tight. So it's quite interesting, that political or social reading of the poem. Thank you for listening. I'll see you guys soon.